Hello, my name is Kyle Michael, and this is a presentation of my final project, which took the form of a lesson plan entitled Diversity in the American Revolution. In my project, I cover the experience of women, lower class individuals, and people of African descent during the Revolution. I chose these groups because they are often left out of the narrative and because through reading and going through the course with the Is Everyone Really Equal reading, it touched on some of the major um, ways in which our society is stratified. And so that's typically along the lines of things like class, race, gender. I wasn't able to include some other differences and other forms of stratification within this project. So, unfortunately, there just isn't any real material on the experience of disabled people in this period. And so some things had to be left out. And also, there's only 45 minutes in a class. So, really, even this project was a bit ambitious in its scope. Uh, I have always been interested in the American Revolution, which is one of the reasons I chose this topic. Uh, but, in my own history classes, it was a very whitewashed, very great man of history experience, right? So you have people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who were very wealthy, very white, and men. So in this project, I use primary sources from the period to express these narratives and I also use a secondary source in there because the experience of um, people of African descent in this period was incredibly limited, um, as they were almost at most in the colonies were enslaved uh, and were not educated, so they couldn't write these experiences. So some were recorded later on. Some some people of African descent were educated. Those are very unique situations, though. So there isn't a ton of content in that area specifically. Um, and I think another thing that really inspired this project was the idea of intersectionality that came through also readings from Is Everyone Really Equal and the conferences and some of the videos that we watched. I, I think that some of the sources that I cover, um, like the Dunmore Proclamation and some of the narratives, the pension narratives, are cover intersectionality. It'll be a bit of a challenge to really get into that with students, but I think those two sources alone provide the opportunity to do that. In the Dunmore uh, Proclamation, we see that it addresses both enslaved individuals and indentured servants who were, the enslaved experience was, on the basis of race. But of course, these people also didn't have any money, so that's some intersectionality coming into play there. You have things like the Dunmore Proclamation, like I was just talking about, which tap into two of those identities. So it's like you will gain your freedom and you'll be paid, so that it appealed to a wider group, and it especially appealed to impoverished people of African descent. And with the pension narratives, that is primarily people who were lower on the socioeconomic spectrum. They they made up the bulk of the American fighting force. We see that they were put into the most difficult situations, um, and that not all of those people were white, and not all of those people were men. There, of course, those narratives are harder to come across, but there were some included in the um, sources that I included. So there was one about you kind of hear these stories of women who would carry water into the battlefield or would help load cannons. So that was one of the ones that really stuck out to me, and one that I would definitely include in those primary source documents. Um, I think that just looking at those sources is a great way to engage with those material and really dig into those narratives. But I wanted to, and so that includes the diversity aspect, right? But what it doesn't include exactly is equity. It's equitable in the sense that it brings all these narratives in and it holds them to the same standard and shows how they're all important. I really try to get at what makes these contributions valuable and why they were so necessary for the revolution to succeed. Um, but really, I wanted to get the equity um, idea, the topic of equity, into the hands of the students. So that's why I included in the lesson plan an assessment and activity that has students writing a letter to the founders that's advocating on behalf of these groups, um, which it requires them to think what were the contributions made by these groups. So they'll include all that in there, and then what possible compensation could have been. Uh, and I expect answers along the lines of freedom for enslaved people, um, suffrage and rights for women, and then also suffrage for the lower class, just people in general. So women of lower class, men, lower class men. I think that it's important too that we remember that they couldn't vote in this period. Um, they couldn't vote for a while after the revolution, and it really is just such a fascinating period because so many people fought for something that didn't end up benefiting them. So they were either lied to, and the promise of some possible benefit came in there. So again, like for enslaved people, they were promised freedom, promised compensation, didn't get it. These lower class men promised compensation, and promised more rights in this country once it was established, and they didn't really get those until later on. And then women also, some women were able to vote in colonial assemblies. They lost that right after the revolution. So you actually have some instances where people are worse off, people that were really valuable to the revolution and necessary for its success were worse off after it. And I think that'll be something that challenges a lot of students, but I think it's a valuable learning experience. There was a lot of challenges in this project, so just finding these sources took quite a while. You might find something that touches on one topic, but in a short class period, I want these sources to hit on as many topics as we can get, and that is it was a very real challenge. And some sources were just too insubstantial. It's hard to find a picture that really gets at anything I want to get at here. You might have just a comment from a politician, which I think is a really interesting and valuable source. But I can't have students spend 7 minutes just looking at one quote where Washington refers to low class individuals as filth, which is something that he did. Um, and that also doesn't really get to the meat of what I want students to learn from this lesson. So that was an interesting challenge. Um, I was very pleased with the idea for the writing a letter because it touches on some higher level of Bloom's, which is the creative aspect, and it brings it all together nicely, right? And this class kind of builds. So you have them reading the sources, getting information from that. I have a little brief mini lecture at the beginning. So they're able to take all of this information from the class. And at the end, in this, the exit ticket letter activity, they bring it all together and are able to synthesize that and create something new and something grounded in equity. And I think I'd really love to see this play out in a classroom because I think it could be a very successful lesson. And then I also learned a lot doing research for this. I kind of knew that it was a bourgeois revolution that benefited white men, but I didn't realize the extent to which women really played a role, and just how betrayed so many groups were after the revolution. That was something I learned from this. So I think someone who studied it extensively, and I didn't even know all of it, this makes it a very valuable lesson. And I think that it can really help guide their understanding of our society, right? And how it is stratified and how there are unequal structures and how those have been there from the very beginning, but also how diversity has been part of our experience from the beginning. I think that stands to be a very beneficial educational outcome here. Yeah, and I think that just within the classroom, this brings in so many more people's stories and helps them feel like they're a part of the classroom community, that their experiences are valid, that they can see people like them in the narrative. Not everyone is an old white plantation owning man, right? So often you have maybe Abigail Adams, maybe is talked about in context of the revolution, and that'll be the only woman talked about for in history, like 100 years. It's terrible. Just how many people's stories are left out, and I think that it makes it so much harder to engage with the content when you don't see anyone like you in it. Also, I think it's important to show that this ties in quite nicely with content standards. I was able to touch on two of them. So that's the History Strand 6 for 8th grade. And that's key events and significant figures in American history influenced the course and outcome of the American Revolution. I hit on a number of key events in here, less on the key. Well, I mean, significant figures, I would argue, are significant. This is such a vague standard, too, that I think it can be interpreted in a lot of ways. And I chose one that is often not the interpretation, but I think that that'll still be quite successful. And they really are engaging with the traditional significant figures, too, because they're writing this letter to people like Jefferson and to people like Washington. And the second standard that I touched on was the outcome of the American Revolution was national independence and new political, social, and economic relationships for the American people. And I think that one really, really ties in nicely with this lesson. In terms of the social and economic relationships and the political ones, right? Because we had these people who lose political rights or who potentially stood to gain some and didn't. I think it really covers that all very nicely. I am excited to see how I can incorporate this into a real classroom, and I'm excited to hear the feedback on it. This was a really fun process. I think it tied in very nicely with content from this course, Equity and Diversity, and it opened my eyes to so many different ways that I can engage with events in history or topics in history, because it is so easy to just focus on the traditional narrative. And for someone like me who is a middle-class white man, it is so easy to focus on that traditional narrative because it's my narrative, right? So, taking everything from this class, it really opened my eyes and showed me how vast the experiences are and how many stories are out there and how many we don't address. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the lesson plan, and I'm looking forward to feedback.